The Gospel according to John, chapter 18, verses 19 to 27. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it, and said, I am not. One of those servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this third reading from chapter 18 of the Gospel of John, we are witness to the continuance of the mock trial, the essentially illegal trial of Jesus in the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. In yesterday's reading, we learned first of Jesus being taken to this palace from Gethsemane by the band of Roman soldiers and the officers of the Sanhedrin. We also learned of Peter and another disciple, we don't know who exactly that is, entering the palace also. That other disciple being known to the high priest and entering easily, Peter being let in at the request of that other disciple, being challenged as to whether he was a follower of Jesus and denying his first denial. And we continue here then with today's reading in verse 19, a glimpse in the Gospel of John of the actual mock trial itself. And it is perplexing. It's a very valid question. Why is the description of this so short in the Gospel of John? Given that John the Apostle was witness to so much of the ministry of Christ and speaks often in great depth and detail, the brevity of the trial itself might be a very good indication that that other disciple was not John the Apostle, although that is the most popularly held belief. The Synoptic Gospels have been in circulation for some time prior to the writing of the Gospel of John, and therefore it may also be that John the Apostle felt that there were other witnesses, in particular Peter, of course, and that's reflected in Mark and thereby in Matthew and Luke, and so he would only add some other details that he may have been party to in speaking to other witnesses. Now, Jesus was taken first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of the high priest and a former high priest himself, and then to Caiaphas. Opinions are mixed as to who the high priest is in verse 19, whether it's Annas or Caiaphas. I think it's very likely that it's Caiaphas, and I think that is the majority opinion of commentators. In any case, it's not so critical given that the trial is essentially illegal. They have bribed someone to bring this prophet from Nazareth to them in the middle of the night, and they are doing this privately without the full Sanhedrin being present. Let's assume it's Caiaphas for the sake of our reading today. Caiaphas asks Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine, such as what is the aim of his ministry, who are full name of his disciples. And Jesus is not going to incriminate either himself or his disciples. He answers in a very simple way. He says that he has spoken openly to the world, teaching in synagogues, teaching in the temple, where Pharisees and scribes have very often been witnesses, and Jesus says, in secret have I said nothing. And what Jesus means here is that even though he may have explained in more detail his doctrine to his disciples, there is no secret knowledge that he has given to them that he has not spoken of in the temple and in the synagogues. Now it's interesting, this next couple of verses. Jesus says, why are you asking me? Ask those that heard me what I have said. And then I think we can understand here that he's looking at the officers of the Sanhedrin who are present. Maybe they're even holding him. And he says, behold, they know what I said. And indeed, we spoke of this yesterday. The officers of the Sanhedrin, many months before at the Feast of the Tabernacles, had been ordered to arrest Jesus. And they had gone to hear him speak in order to arrest him. And they came back empty-handed. This is in chapter 7 of John. I'll just read a few verses here, 45 to 47. Then came the officers to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said unto them, why have ye not brought him? The officers answered, never man spake like this man. Then answered them the Pharisees, are ye also deceived? So the religious elite, the Jewish elite, can't believe that the officers returned empty-handed, but the officers were in awe of the teaching of Jesus. They were in awe of Jesus in Gethsemane, as we learned at the beginning of this chapter. But now Jesus is bound. He's in the palace of the high priest, and he's saying to Caiaphas, your officers have heard me teach. They know what I said. And something has changed now. The fact that Jesus is a captive, that he's yet, a prisoner. They're used to dealing with prisoners. He's now a prisoner. He's not a teacher. They feel very comfortable mistreating him. And one of the officers strikes Jesus. Now the Greek here can either indicate being struck with a rod or with the palm of the hand, and the original meaning actually was rod. Opinions are divided whether Jesus was struck with a rod or a stick, or whether he was essentially slapped in the face with the palm of the hand. In either case, it's either very brutal and or very humiliating, and this officer who has struck Jesus says essentially, how dare you be so disrespectful to the high priest. And Jesus is appealing now. There's even teaching here. He's appealing to this man's conscience. If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, you should not strike me. And that's true, of course, absolutely true. We're reminded, of course, of the Sermon on the Mount and the teaching there. This will be chapter 5 of Matthew and verse 39. Let me actually read verse 38 first. Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil. Ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. we have an instance here of Jesus not resisting the evil. He's bound. He's been struck, possibly with a rod, very, very painfully and cruelly, and he simply reasons with this aggressive officer, and we have very clear evidence here of the illegality of the trial. This is not obviously a legal trial. You can't beat the accused during a trial if you want to have a fair trial. Now, verse 24 is the last verse that we have in John, believe it or not, of the trial of Jesus with Caiaphas, and this is described in far more detail in the Synoptic Gospels. It's rather an enigmatic verse. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. And even with the original Greek, and with which has more fluid tenses and cases of verbs, it's not really clear what is meant here. One interpretation, and I would say commentators are evenly divided here, one interpretation is that Jesus here has been questioned by Annas kind of illegally, but he's still bound, and he's now going to be sent to Caiaphas the high priest for a more formal trial, which is simply completely absent from the chapter on the basis that it's well known from the synoptics. The other interpretation, which I find personally more likely, and this is certainly the view of Johann Bengel, is that Jesus has been interviewed here in the preceding verses by Caiaphas, and verse 24 is just a little note to say that Jesus, while being struck and not resisting the evil, was unable to in any way defend himself because he was bound. His hands were tied behind his back. So it's simply referring to the past. Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. I think that's more likely because the fact that the person interviewing Jesus is repeatedly spoken of as the high priest, and Caiaphas is the high priest, it seems odd if that were to be Annas, who was not the high priest at that time. Just to remind ourselves of the nature of that trial, and we can read this in Mark and Matthew, and those passages have been covered in the Gospel Year, and I will include those links in the description below this video. We remember that false witnesses were brought who couldn't agree between them, and Caiaphas was increasingly frustrated, and he finally demanded that Jesus say whether or not he was the Son of God. And Jesus said, "Thou sayest it." And Caiaphas claimed that was blasphemy, rent his clothes, which was the symbolic form of witnessing gross blasphemy on the part of the high priest, and he asked the council whether this blasphemy was sufficient for a sentence of death, and the council said it was. All of this is absent from the description in the Gospel of John. We return instead to the denials of Peter. He is warming himself by those coals in the courtyard of the high palace. It's thought perhaps that the trial was occurring on a sort of raised stage area, sort of an inner enclosure, but still open to the lower courtyard where servants and maybe other officers and also Simon Peter were standing. A question, that other disciple who let Simon Peter in, where was he standing? Unknown. In any case, it is so dreadful and tragic here, the denial of Simon Peter. Amazing what the fear of a group can do to the best of us. Nothing perhaps more frightening in the world than an antagonistic group, because they're capable of anything, any evil. Simon Peter, I'm sure, is very frightened and doesn't know what to do. He is probably disconsolate, desolate by the ill treatment of his master. He's warming himself, though, by these coals, and he is essentially standing as one of the accusers. But he's accused himself. Those standing around say to him, "Art not thou also one of his disciples?" And he denies a second time and says, "I am not." We learn from the Synoptic Gospels the basis for this accusation was his speech. You also are a Galilean, thy speech betrayeth thee. Or actually this funny word, bewrayeth thee. He denies, "I am not." And an additional detail here from John, that this third accusation comes indeed from a kinsman, perhaps a cousin or brother of the servant of the high priest who was attacked by Peter in Gethsemane. "Did I not see thee in the garden with him?" So this kinsman would have been with the officers, would have seen the disciples, and perhaps they were a little bit behind Jesus, more in shadow. He would possibly have seen the person that struck his kinsman. I think if he'd witnessed that clearly, he would be far more explicit here, and he wouldn't say, "I saw you in the garden, I saw you attack my kinsman." So he's not sure, but there's something about Peter that he finds extremely suspicious. And Peter denies the third time, and immediately the cock crows. And that's the very concise description of the denials we have in the Gospel of John. John is not taking any pains to, let's say, humiliate Peter. Peter very honourably, as the person who essentially provided eyewitness testimony to the scribe Mark, who wrote the Gospel according to Mark, opened his heart about these denials and does not try to prettify his behaviour. It was dreadful. It was one of the lowest, quite likely the lowest point of his entire life. Perhaps the only worst time being the either witnessing or learning of the crucifixion of Jesus. And just to give you a bit of contrast here, if we look in, say, the Gospel of Matthew, when he is accused the third time, yes, and actually here's this word, bewrayeth thee. I'll read verses 73 to 75 of chapter 27 of Matthew, the third denial. "And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, Surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly." So we are not party in the Gospel of John to the fact that Peter didn't just deny, he cursed and swore at that third accusation. And hearing the cock crow, he departed from the palace, bitterly weeping. Such a tragic and profound betrayal of his faith and his love in the Son of God.